Week after week, Oda had been hinting at some tragic past that connects Gunko and Brook, and after reading chapter 1149, I think I can confidently say I know the answer. A huge shout out to TD Legend who dropped a comment during the reaction stream, and this is what kicked off my speculations. What if Brook was Gunko's royal guard? After reading that, my brain just clicked. All the puzzle pieces just came into place. Because if you've been following my channel, you'll know that I have already shared my thoughts on this topic before, and as many have pointed out, I have to admit I was on the right direction. We were halfway there, and now it's time to put it all together. So you may remember that previously my theory was that Gunko and Brook served together as part of the royal guard of a yet to be disclosed kingdom. They were comrades, they fought side by side, they were part of the same convoy. Whereas now, chapter 1149 shows Gunko as a young child playing with Brook, enjoying his music, and here it seems like Gunko was a child whereas Brook was already an adult, suggesting that it's unlikely that these two were soldiers together, that they were part of the battle convoy at the same time. So, what if Gunko was the princess of a former kingdom, the kingdom where Brook served as part of her royal guard, and this kingdom would later become the victim of a native hunting competition, just like God Valley, a competition arrayed that resulted in the death of most of Gunko's royal family and the dissolution of Brook's royal guard, kicking off Brook's journey as a pirate, not knowing that one member of the family, Princess Gunko, remained alive, but captive in the hands of Imu and the world government. I think there are loads of clues pointing to this. But before we begin, please take a quick second to click subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate your help in getting to 100,000 subscribers, and in return, I'll make sure you never run out of juicy One Piece discussions. With that being said, here we go. As soon as I had this thought of Gunko being a lost princess of a kingdom that no longer exists, you know what popped into my head? Anastasia. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Anastasia is an animated historical fantasy film centering on a fictionalized account of the Russian Revolution and the speculations that one of the royal Romanov family, the Grand Duchess Anastasia, survived the revolution. Fun fact, this was actually a real-life speculation that existed and resulted in several imposters claiming to be the princess, which was later disproved. But for the purposes of this classic film, following the attack on the royal family, Anastasia escapes, becomes an orphan suffering memory loss, and the story focuses on her journey to discovering her identity and finding love on the way. This was actually one of my favorite films, absolute favorite films growing up, and I could probably still sing many of the songs from this soundtrack if you asked me to, but I suppose no one's asking me to, so we shall move on. Because I think there are huge similarities between this fictionalized account of the Russian Revolution to Gunko's tragic past. Loads of parallels between the missing princess, Grand Duchess Anastasia, and the forgotten or the lost, brainwashed princess Gunko. Let's start off with their designs. This page boy cap is a key part of Gunko's design that has drawn a lot of attention ever since Gunko was introduced as a character, especially because this cap bears similarity to one that another character in the series wears, Koala of the Revolutionary Army, who comes from a very tragic past herself, being a former slave who also wears a very similar cap. And you know that I have speculated on a relationship between these two characters in the past as well. Interestingly enough, it just so happens that this page boy cap is also a key part of Anastasia's design in the film. And I also have to say, quite funnily, when we see Anastasia wear this cap before she discovers her identity as a princess, she appears to have short hair. But then by the end of the film, after, she goes through her princessification, she actually has long hair, which is sort of, I guess, what we see in chapter 1149. Gunko in the present has short hair, whereas it seems like she may have sported a longer hairstyle in the past when she was potentially a part of the royal family. And then by the end of this chapter, she also appears to have long hair as well. And I do have thoughts as to why she suddenly has longer hair by the end of this chapter when Imu is in control of her body, but we'll get to that later. For now, I think it's very fair to say that Oda was likely influenced by the design and by the story of Anastasia. This film was very highly acclaimed upon its release, receiving various awards and nominations, including at the Oscars. It was also later adapted for musicals, including in Japan. Not to mention that Anastasia was released the same year that One Piece began, 1997, and I would just imagine that an animated film that made waves globally was likely to have, piqued the interest of Oda, whom we know loves adventure, loves history, loves fantasy. But even without making these parallels, these connections to the Anastasia film, or even the real life story, the real life mystery, I do think this idea of Brook being Gunko's royal guard is very compelling. I have seen people speculate that Brook is actually Gunko's father, but I tend to disagree. So in the mini flashback, or the glimpses of Gunko's memories, we see first an older Gunko who's probably a teenager, a young adult at this stage. We see her screaming out father. And then we see a panel featuring the silhouettes of a much younger Gunko and an adult Brook. But then when we jump back into reality, Gunko starts running, she's calling out Brook's name, she's thinking of him, and this is what makes me think that he's not her dad. Because if Brook was really her father, I feel like she would be actually calling out father, dad. But the fact that she's calling him by name, that to me suggests that he was an adult figure who obviously played a big role in her past, and someone who may have been there when her father was lost. That period in her life where she's calling out for her father's name, Brook was somehow involved. Now, of course, there are some people who do call parents by their names, but I do think that's less common. And I also think if Brook was her father, then his reaction would also be stronger, because he has clearly been in disbelief and quite shaken up, to be fair, ever since he thought he recognized Gunko. And we also see in chapter 1149, he's not focusing on how to escape these dire situations that he and his crew members are in, because he's distracted by the similarities between Gunko and that mysterious person of his past. But then if that person of his past was his own flesh and blood, his own daughter, I would just imagine that he would have an even more visceral reaction. You know what I mean? So for now, I am going to stick with this theory, stick with this answer, the most likely answer, that Brook was the royal guard that served Gunko's royal family. And in that case, Brook would definitely be a key figure that was involved to her family and to the circumstances of that situation where Gunko is calling out for her father, because Brook served also as his royal guard. He was there when her father was being taken away, when her father was being killed. Perhaps Brook failed to protect him, but perhaps Brook managed to save Gunko. I should also point out at this stage that I know I keep calling her Gunko, but it is very unlikely that Gunko is this character's real name. This seems to be a name that was most likely given to her, forced upon her by the world government after she got kidnapped by them, which we will get to a little bit later, especially because Gunko in Japanese can be translated to war drum, or military child, or army child. Her name literally means child soldier, which I didn't know about before. I only actually searched that up very recently, and I find that mind-blowing. I actually can't believe that I didn't take the time to search this up earlier. Shame on me. But obviously, because we don't know her actual name as of yet, we are going to have to, unfortunately, keep calling her Gunko. Actually, just for fun, if I was to give her a name, if I was to speculate on a name that would be fitting, I would actually say Rosalia. There is an obvious connection to the flower rose, so that would keep consistent with Oda's naming convention for female characters being named after either a flower or a bird. And then I think there are also some other really cool connections. Importantly, Rosalia is the term given to a type of harmonic sequence, also known as the sound of music. And sequences are a very common feature in Baroque music in particular. And I think you would agree with me that Baroque sounds very similar to Brook, who is, of course, a musician. Which is important because Gunko is now connected to Brook, and both of them have obvious, very clear ties to music. Not to mention that Rosalia, or Rosa, is the name of several royal figures in Austrian history, and that's important because Oda said that if Brook lived in our real world, he would be from Austria, and so then it would make sense that Gunko would also be from Austria if she was alive in our real world, if they were both from the same kingdom. Alternatively, another name could be Edelweiss. Edelweiss is the national flower of Austria, again a flower, also linked to music via the song named Edelweiss in the musical The Sound of Music. And here we have The Sound of Music again. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, The Sound of Music is a musical set against the backdrop of Austria right on the brink of annexation into Nazi Germany. And just as a fun fact, I actually played Gretel in a stage production of The Sound of Music when I was younger. And I know this just started off as fun speculations on potential names, but then this recurring idea of The Sound of Music really got me thinking. There are actually quite a lot of parallels here too to The Sound of Music. There's the Austrian connection, there's the music connection, and then even the story or the setting of The Sound of Music of an Austria before being swallowed up by Nazi Germany. I feel like that really fits my original idea. And for those of you who don't remember or haven't watched that video, which I highly recommend you do go watch later, what if Brooke and Gunko were the victims of a former royal kingdom that was the victim of a native hunt, and that's why their kingdom now no longer exists? If Brooke and Gunko's kingdom was previously unaffiliated with the world government, their tragic history could be the story of how their kingdom was abolished by the evil world government, very similar circumstances to what happened at God Valley, with parallels of the world government being like Nazi Germany in this scenario, which also fits when you consider the racist worldview that both have, as well as the very inhumane cruelty that they've inflicted on others. And as I explained in my previous video, it seems like Brooke holds fond memories of his time in that previous kingdom, so it really didn't feel like he left of his own accord. Something forced him to no longer serve on that battle convoy. In fact, the parallel that I drew back then was that what happened to Fujitora is similarly what happened to Brooke, because it was very recently revealed by way of Vivre cards and special interviews with Oda that Isho, aka Fujitora, was also a military officer of a kingdom that now no longer exists. The former Aoi kingdom, which was destroyed, leaving Isho to work as a security guard whilst being branded as a war criminal before being drafted into the Marines to be an admiral. I think that something very similar happened to Brooke, but because he's always harbored this romance for piracy, as we found out in chapter 1149, when his former kingdom was destroyed, he chose a life of piracy instead. And it seems like Brooke was under the belief that the entire royal family died, and this is why he felt that he had no reason to stay as the royal guard. His kingdom no longer existed. He didn't know that Gunko was actually alive, that she survived. But in fact, what actually happened instead is that Gunko got kidnapped. Gunko was taken by the world government. And going back to this idea that their former kingdom was the location of a previous native hunt, who knows, maybe even the first native hunt. In the God Valley flashback, we found out that God Valley was specifically chosen because the Celestial Dragons wanted the natural minerals, the natural resources that were abundant at God Valley, and also because God Valley was an unaffiliated country. I think there could be a very special reason why Brooke and Gunko's home country was chosen, but this time, instead of it being something special to do with the land itself, maybe it has something to do with the special royal family, and specifically something special about Gunko herself. It seems like Gunko has been especially marked out of the rest of the Holy Knights, and she alone has the ability to teleport her comrades, similar to how that was a special ability of Saint Saturn's, not to mention that Gunko's Arrow Devil Fruit ability seems very similar to what we've seen of Imu's attacks back in chapter 1085. Imu has also specifically chosen to take over Gunko's body as opposed to any of the other God's Knights here at Elbaf, and maybe all of this is possible, or all of this is because of who Gunko is specifically. Alternatively, I think there's cause to believe that Imu is targeting the princesses of royal family specifically. We know that Imu is especially obsessed with the women of the Nefertari family, but it does extend beyond this because we've also seen that Shirahoshi was one of the key figures whose photograph that Imu possessed, and so maybe Gunko was also a former target of Imu's that Imu successfully acquired. I mean, maybe it has something to do with some sort of ancient prophecy that involves a princess from a royal line. I mean, we do know that princesses are key figures throughout the whole of One Piece. Almost every arc centers around helping a princess of an island. In any case, I think we can safely add Gunko to the list of people that became victims of Saint Saturn's experiments. We know that that's what happened to Ginny, forced to be the 8th wife of a yet-to-be-disclosed celestial dragon, and then later the subject of Saint Saturn's experimentations, which is what resulted in her being afflicted with the sapphire scales. In Gunko's case, it seems like that the experiment centered around her being some sort of host for Imu, as well as removing her original identity so that she could become Gunko, so that they could erase her original identity and replace her with Gunko. Again, quite literally, Gunko is child soldier, indoctrinating her in the ways of the world government and the celestial dragon so that she feels apathy and actual disgust for humans whilst believing in the superiority of the celestial dragons, except this clearly hasn't worked perfectly because some of her old memories remain dormant. And this time I actually want to turn my head to another very highly acclaimed film, one that I think can sort of help make sense of what's happening to Gunko right now at the end of chapter 1149. When we see some of her original memories come through, fight through, I can't help but be reminded of the film Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele. And if you haven't watched that film, then I highly recommend that you go watch that film as well. Super good. But I won't say too much because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But for those of you who have watched the film, let me know what you think. Do you see where I'm going with this? And on that note, it does bring us to what we were touching on earlier. Why Gunko has longer hair, why she has long hair whilst under Imu's control. There are many ways we can read this. Firstly, is this Imu's appearance that is appearing through Gunko? Is this what Imu actually looks like, confirming that Imu is actually a woman, or at least someone with long feminine hair? Alternatively, is this person that we see at the end of the chapter Gunko's original appearance, and is this what Gunko looked like before she became Gunko? Because again, back in the flashback panels, we do see that Gunko did indeed have longer hair in the past. So is it the case that the way that the indoctrination, the way that the transformation works, the way that the host body thing works, is that when Gunko is short hair Gunko, that is the indoctrinated child soldier that comprises half of who she is. We have talked about multiple times in the past that Gunko does seem like she has this duality theme, that there's two sides of Gunko. One of those sides is the Gunko side, and she has a literally physically different self. But then her original self, the original self that lies dormant, she still looks the same as she did. She's still alive both physically and mentally, just lying dormant in the background, in the back of the mind. And to make sure that that original Gunko, that original Rosalia, that original Edelweiss never gains control, Imu possesses that part of Gunko. And whenever it seems like she may break out, Imu's able to possess her instead. Or a third alternative, which seemed to be the most popular reaction based on the live stream, the third option is that this is Imu appearing in Nefertari Lily's body, but by possessing Gunko. So it's Imu in Lily's body, but actually appearing through Gunko. Perhaps the reason why Lily never made it to Arabasta is because she was taken kidnapped by Imu, and Imu took over her appearance, took over her body. Perhaps you can even assume that Imu has achieved immortality throughout the centuries by constantly taking on other people's bodies, and for some reason Imu is just obsessed with young beautiful women. Again, maybe it has something to do with an ancient prophecy, or maybe it has something to do with Imu themselves, who they were originally. Maybe Imu is originally a woman who just wants wants to keep her youthful look in a sort of twisted Rapunzel scenario. This could even be why Ginny was taken and experimented on, why Ginny specifically was taken and experimented on. Maybe why she was forced to become a celestial dragon's wife, so that she could keep breeding new, beautiful young women that Imu could take control over. Which is sick and twisted, as I'm sure you would all agree. But I do actually want to point out yet another historical detail here, one that I do think could have potential parallels, because under the Nazi regime, there was something called the Lebensborn program, and that was a project to encourage the growth of a purely Aryan Germany. And this involved breeding programs, including homes specifically set up for unmarried Aryan women to have children with Aryan SS soldiers to give birth to more perfect Aryan babies. And this project actually also resulted in forced pregnancies, i.e. women who were taken there non-consensually, as well as the kidnapping of children who were thought to fit the Aryan criteria. And you can let me know if you think I'm reading too much into things, but I do think that Oda could be drawing on yet another historical influence for his story. But this at the moment is currently where my head is at. I really like this idea that Brooke was Gunko's royal guard. Brooke is the princess of a former royal kingdom, a kingdom that was attacked by the world government that resulted in the death of most of her family, something that Brooke feels extremely regretful for, thinking that he wasn't able to protect that royal family, not knowing that the youngest daughter, Rosalia Edelweiss, the original Gunko, that one of the royal heirs, did in fact survive, but was tragically taken by the world government, brainwashed, indoctrinated, and that is the Gunko we see today. Let me know what you think on this theory by leaving a comment below. Again, please do subscribe to the channel to help out a fellow One Piece fan reach 100,000 subscribers. You can also further help support the channel by becoming a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people. But as always, thank you so much for listening to another one of my crazy ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.